Imagine, like, conquering the largest empire in human history.
Right. The ultimate military victory.
Exactly. I mean, your cavalry has just wiped out massive armies. You've burned capitals to the ground, terrified entire continents. You've won.
You hold all the cards.
Yeah. But then, a few decades later, your descendants are sitting on thrones wearing the traditional silk robes of the exact people you conquered.
And speaking their language.
Yes. Speaking their language and using their ancient bureaucratic systems to collect your taxes. It's like, you won the war, but somehow you became the very thing you conquered.
It completely upends how we usually think about power, doesn't it? I mean, and collapse, too.
Right, because usually a collapse is a reset.
Exactly. When we look at global history, the fall of a capital usually means the end of a civilization. The aqueducts stop flowing, the language fractures, the central administration just vanishes.
The people survive, but they enter a totally different era.
Right. But in the region we are analyzing today, the imperial center can be completely obliterated by foreign invaders, and yet the cultural logic, the writing systems, the underlying social hierarchy, it all survives.
It doesn't just survive, it actively absorbs the invaders.
Yes. It's fascinating.
And that profound paradox is the core mission of our deep dive today. We are looking at East Asia.
A massive topic.
A huge topic. We're talking about a region that went from scattered nomadic tribes navigating the steppes all the way to, like, neon-drenched, hyper-connected megacities. And they did it without ever truly hitting the reset button on their culture.
Which is incredibly rare.
Totally. So we're drawing from this deeply fascinating document we've received titled eastasia.pdf. It's this really idiosyncratic collection of historical notes, sociological mapping, personal reflections.
It's a very rich source.
It really is. And our goal is to take this source material and use it to deconstruct East Asia. Not just as a static map of borders for you listening, but as a massive 3,000-year-old operating system that just constantly updates and remixes itself.
I love that analogy, an operating system.
Right. And I have to say, looking at your background visual right now, it perfectly captures the theme.
Oh, yeah, the transition.
Yeah, so for you listening, the backdrop has been slowly transitioning from these ancient ink-wash paintings of misty mountain landscapes, and it's seamlessly bleeding into a modern, glowing, cyberpunk cityscape.
The visual transition really mirrors the source material's core argument. Because to understand East Asia, which the notes define primarily as China, the Korean Peninsula, Japan, Mongolia, and Taiwan, we really have to discard the idea that it has ever been a single monolithic civilizational block.
It's not just one big homogeneous zone.
Not at all. It is, and always has been, this dense, deeply entangled zone of exchange. But, before we get to the philosophy or the empires or the art, the sources insist we start with the physical Earth itself.
The geography?
Exactly. The hardware.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the document argues that to understand the cultural software, you first have to understand that physical hardware. And we aren't just talking about a vague sense of like, oh, there are mountains in the west and an ocean in the east.
Right. It's much more extreme than that.
Yeah, we are talking about massive climatic barriers that forced entirely different human survival strategies.
The physical setting is a landscape of punishing extremes. And it dictates literally everything. I mean, from what people eat to how they build their societies.
So paint that picture for us.
Well, if you look west and southwest, the Tibetan Plateau stands as this massive geological fortress wall. It's huge.
Like the roof of the world.
Exactly. And then you move north and northwest, and you hit the severe arid steppe zones and the Gobi Desert.
Which are incredibly harsh environments.
Incredibly harsh. In these environments, the lack of rainfall makes intensive agriculture physically impossible.
You just can't farm it.
You can't. The land simply cannot support massive populations of settled farmers. So the survival strategy that naturally evolved there was pastoral nomadism.
Meaning you rely on herds.
Right. Herds of horses, sheep, cattle. Your wealth is mobile because you have to be mobile to follow the grass. And because of that, your society is decentralized and highly militarized out of necessity.
Because you have to protect those herds from rivals or predators.
Exactly. But then, and this is where it gets interesting, you cross a certain geographic threshold moving east, and the rules of survival completely flip.
You cross into the monsoonal zones.
Yes. The eastern river valleys, the peninsulas, the thousands of miles of Pacific coastline.
Where there's actually rain.
A lot of rain.
Mm-hmm.
Here, the heavy seasonal rains in those fertile plains allow for something entirely different, which is intensive agriculture.
Specifically rice and millet, right?
Right. You have the cultivation of rice in the warmer, wetter south and millet or wheat in the drier northern plains.
So the sources outline a very stark ecological split here. You basically have a rice world, a millet world, and a pastoral world.
Yes, three distinct survival zones.
And the people living in these distinct worlds didn't just, suddenly spawn there as fully formed nations. The text is very clear on busting this myth of original nations.
Oh, completely. Ancient DNA and the archaeological record completely dismantle the idea of a pure, isolated founding population for any of these modern countries.
It's a lot messier than that.
Much messier. The early human history of East Asia is a story of highly fluid, shifting networks. You have foragers, fishers, early farmers, constantly migrating through inland corridors and southern coastal pathways.
Just constantly mixing.
Constantly mixing.
And the document uses the Jimon people in Japan as like a perfect illustration of this early fluidity, right?
The Jimon are a brilliant anomaly in human history. They really are.
Why is that?
Well, usually we associate the invention of pottery with the invention of settled farming.
Because you need pots to store the grain you just harvested?
Exactly. People invent clay pots because they have a surplus of food they need to keep safe. But the Jomon were foragers.
Wait, they didn't farm.
No, they thrived on fishing, hunting, and woodland gathering. Because the Japanese archipelago was so incredibly rich in marine and forest resources, they were actually able to settle down in semi-permanent villages without farming.
Wow. So they just had so much food around them they didn't need to plant crops.
Right. And they created this elaborate pottery thousands of years before intensive rice agriculture ever arrived on the islands.
That's wild. They built a complex, long-lived society based purely on the bounty of their specific geographic niche.
Exactly.
But, if the geography was so distinct, if you have groups like the Jomon thriving on an island and people figuring out millet farming in massive river valleys and nomads surviving on the arid steppes, why didn't they just stay completely isolated in those bubbles?
It's a good question.
Like, if Japan is completely surrounded by ocean, why bother interacting with the mainland at all? Just stay on the island.
Well, the sea is a barrier, sure, but it is also a highway.
Oh, I like that.
The sources describe this continuous oscillation between connectivity and closure. Basically, geography created vulnerabilities that forced interaction.
How so?
Consider the concept of maritime insulation versus continental exposure.
Okay, let's break those down.
So, Japan had maritime insulation. The ocean protected them from land-based invasions.
Meaning they could never be easily overrun by the nomadic cavalries that plagued the mainland.
Right. A horse army can't cross the ocean. But they were close enough to the continent that when a massive, highly advanced civilization began to emerge in the Yellow River Basin, Japan could look across the water and say, hey, we want some of that.
They could selectively import the technologies and ideas they wanted without the fear of being conquered by them.
Exactly. But while they had that luxury, the communities on the mainland had no such luxury.
Because they had continental exposure?
Yes. Northern China suffered from profound continental exposure. There is no ocean protecting its northern flank.
It's just the steppe.
Just a massive, porous frontier separating the settled farmers from the mobile, militarized steppe nomads.
So they were forever locked into this dynamic of trade, tension, and warfare.
Right. East Asia didn't develop as a series of isolated bubbles. It developed as a patchwork of agrarian heartlands inexorably linked to frontier zones and maritime trade routes.
Which brings us to the moment where one of those agrarian heartlands figures out how to basically hack the system.
Yes. The dense agricultural zones, particularly in the Yellow River Basin, begin producing immense wealth.
Massive food surpluses. And historically, as we know, surplus food leads to hierarchy, right?
Always. Surplus food leads to hierarchy, which leads to administration. You need people to manage the grain.
And the sources describe this as the creation of the Sinic Corps.
Right. We see this crystallized during the early Bronze Age, with polities like the Shang and later the Zhou dynasties.
And what emerges here isn't just a country, right? It's much bigger than that.
It's not just a political state. It is a comprehensive civilizational system. The Zhou dynasty, in particular, lays down enduring frameworks. They establish a centralized bureaucratic state.
And we really need to look at the mechanics of this bureaucracy, because it's not just kings and lords ruling by brute force.
No, it's highly structured.
The sources emphasize the eventual development of merit-based civil service exams, which is huge.
It is a radical departure from feudalism based purely on bloodlines.
Like we see in a lot of European history.
Exactly. The system relied on an elite class of scholar officials. To gain power, You didn't just inherit a piece of land from your father.
You had to pass a test.
You had to pass incredibly grueling multi-day examinations. And these tests were brutal. They tested your mastery of classical texts, poetry, administrative law.
So it created a unified, standardized elite class that was loyal to the system and the state, rather than just their local warlord.
Precisely. And it was paired with Confucian ethics, which prioritized social order, hierarchy, and duty to the family and the ruler.
So think about this from the perspective of neighboring regions for a second. The notes call these neighbors the orbiting cultures.
Right, the cultures surrounding the Sinic core.
Yeah. So they look at the Sinic core and they see a massively successful system. It's organizing millions of people. It's building immense irrigation networks. It's generating huge wealth.
And obviously they want those results.
Of course they do. But they don't just adopt it wholesale. They bring the core concepts in and fundamentally remix them. It's like an open source software almost, Linux or something. China wrote the original code, but these other cultures downloaded it and installed their own custom mods and skins.
That is a perfect analogy. Look at the Korean Peninsula, for example. The source material refers to them as the faithful adapter.
Okay, the faithful adapter, why?
Geographically, Korea is attached directly to the mainland, acting as a bridge. So the later Korean states, especially the Joseon dynasty, they deeply adopted this Confucian bureaucracy.
They took the code.
They took the code. They implemented their own civil service exams, elevating a scholarly elite class known as the Yangban. They embraced the strict hierarchical social structures and the philosophical texts.
But as you said, they didn't just become a carbon copy.
No, they maintained a fiercely distinct national identity. And the greatest mechanical proof of this is their language.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
Yeah, it really is. For centuries, the Korean elite used Chinese characters for official writing.
Because that was the prestige language of the region.
Right. But spoken Korean and spoken Chinese are from entirely different language families. Their grammars are completely incompatible.
It's like trying to write English using only Egyptian hieroglyphs or something.
Exactly. Using Chinese characters to write Korean was incredibly inefficient. And it was exclusionary, too. It meant the common people could never learn to read or write.
So what did they do?
Well, in the 15th century, King Sejong oversees the creation of Hangul.
An entirely new hyperlogical phonetic alphabet.
It is arguably one of the most scientifically designed writing systems on Earth.
The sources mention that it actually maps the shape of the characters to the physical shape your mouth makes when pronouncing the sounds. That is mind-blowing.
It's brilliant. It was a way to maintain their independent cultural voice while still operating a state modeled on the bureaucratic power of the Sinic system.
Okay, so that's Korea. Then you have Japan, which the source labels the selective remixer.
The selective remixer, yeah.
And this goes back to my earlier question about borrowing things. Japan has that maritime insulation, so how did they process this massive influence from the mainland?
Well, their geographical distance meant they could modulate their intake. They were like, we'll take this, but we won't take that.
They sent emissaries over, right?
Yes, they sent emissaries to the mainland to study statecraft, architecture, religion. They imported Buddhism, which had journeyed all the way from India through China and Korea.
And they imported the Chinese writing system, kanji.
Right, and faced the exact same linguistic nightmare as the Koreans, trying to fit a completely different spoken language onto an imported writing system.
But wait, so why didn't they adopt the entire bureaucratic package? Like, why didn't Japan have those grueling civil service exams?
This is where the remixing happens. The Japanese imperial court initially tried. They tried to set up a centralized Chinese-style bureaucracy. But over time, the practical realities of managing a mountainous island geography just broke that centralization down.
Because it's too hard to control everyone when they're separated by mountains and sea.
Exactly. So instead of a society led by scholars who passed written tests, power shifted to provincial military clans.
The samurai.
Yes, they elevated a warrior elite, the samurai class. They developed the shogunate, which was essentially a military dictatorship operating under the nominal authority of the emperor.
So they took the imported philosophies like Zen Buddhism and Confucian loyalty and just grafted them onto their own indigenous Shinto traditions and martial codes.
Right, creating a society that looked fundamentally different from the scholar-led mainland.
So what we are really looking at here is an ancient, incredibly powerful version of soft power.
Absolutely.
Because China wasn't marching armies across the sea to force Japan to use its writing system. The neighboring polities adopted these systems because they were just highly effective.
It created a massive cultural sphere bound by shared ideas. even when they were politically fractured or openly hostile to one another. It's the gravitational pull of a prestige culture.
Right.
But we have to remember, this system was not purely theoretical. It was constantly being tested, hacked, and violently disrupted.
By the forces operating outside those agricultural valleys, the disruptors.
Disruptors, yes.
The notes emphasize that you absolutely cannot understand East Asia without understanding the brutal, repeating conflict between the settled farmers and the mobile nomads of the steppes. We're talking about groups like the Xiongnu, the Mongols, the Manchus.
The tension there is structural. It's built into the differing survival mechanics we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
Well, a bureaucratic farming state requires predictability. You need peasants to stay on their land, dig the canals, and surrender a portion of their harvest to the capital.
You need them to stay put and pay taxes.
Right, but the nomadic lifestyle requires extreme mobility. When the climate shifts, say, when a severe winter kills the grass on the steppes, the nomads face starvation. They cannot just wait for a harvest.
Because there is no harvest.
Exactly. They must move, and they must raid or trade with the settled agrarian zones just to survive.
And when those trade relationships break down or when the agrarian empires grow weak, those borders just shatter.
They completely shatter.
The sources map this out as an incredible historical loop. They actually call it the East Asian cycle.
It's a very recognizable pattern.
Yeah, it goes like this. You have a period of intense diversity and warring states. Eventually, that gets unified into a massive empire. The empire standardizes the culture, builds walls, and thrives.
For a while, at least.
Right, for a while. But eventually, internal corruption rots the bureaucracy, or the external pressure from the nomads becomes too great. This leads to fragmentation and collapse. And then someone new picks up the pieces, and the cycle just begins again. Rinse and repeat.
But what makes this cycle unique to East Asia is the phenomenon of assimilation.
The great paradox we opened with.
Exactly. When the mobile, militarized nomads finally breach the Great Wall and conquer the agrarian states, they face a mechanical problem.
Right.
How do you govern 100 million settled farmers from horseback?
Wait, yeah, here's where it gets really interesting. Are you saying the conquerors won the military war but essentially lost the cultural war?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, power can conquer the land, but the system often conquers the conquerors. You can't just raid them forever. You need a system to extract that wealth systematically.
Let's look at the mechanical reality of the Mongol Empire as an example of this.
Perfect example. They conquered China through unmatched cavalry tactics and siege warfare. But once Kublai Khan establishes the Yuan dynasty, he cannot run a massive agrarian economy using the decentralized tribal structures of the steppe.
Because it just doesn't scale to that level of agriculture.
It doesn't. He needs local administrators. He needs tax registers. He needs the scholars.
So what does he do?
Despite deep resistance from traditional Mongol warlords who literally just wanted to turn northern China into pasture land for their horses.
Which is a crazy thought.
Kublai integrates the existing scholar officials. He adopts the bureaucratic apparatus. He physically moves the capital to modern-day Beijing to bridge the steppe and the Sone.
He essentially steps into the very operating system he just conquered.
He had to make it work.
And the sources point out this happens again centuries later with the Manchus.
Yes. The Manchus conquer Ming China and establish the Qing dynasty, ruling for over 250 years.
And the mechanics of their rule are fascinating, right?
They are. Because they do maintain a strict elite identity. They enforce the Q hairstyle on the Han Chinese population as a sign of submission.
Right, the braided hair with the shaved forehead.
Exactly. And they keep certain military banners exclusively Manchu. But mechanically? Mechanically, they adopt the entire Confucian statecraft to legitimize their rule.
They just plug themselves into the mainframe.
They do. They translate the classical texts. They patronize the civil service exams. The Manchu emperors become the ultimate patrons of Chinese high culture, poetry, and art.
So the conquerors win the land, but the system conquers the conquerors.
This creates what the source material calls the long memory effect.
I love that phrase, the long memory.
It's very accurate. The dynasties fall, the capitals burn, millions die in horrific rebellions. But the underlying cultural logic, the reverence for the written word, the bureaucratic ideal, the social hierarchies, it persists across millennia.
It's wild to think about. A scholar in the Han Dynasty in 200 BCE and a civil servant in 19th century Korea. They're operating on a continuum of shared structural values.
Exactly. Thousands of years apart, but running on the same core code.
So Thousands of years of this intense cycle building, collapsing, adapting, and absorbing didn't just create empires. The document argues it forged a very specific set of cultural survival tools for the everyday people living inside the system.
Survival mechanics.
Right, and these survival mechanics are deeply misunderstood, often heavily stereotyped by the rest of the world today. So let's dig into the reality of these tools, starting with probably the biggest misconception: the homogeneous myth.
Oh, this is a crucial point in the sources. The assumption that East Asian societies are massive, uniform blocks of identical people is a profound illusion.
It's an illusion largely projected by the modern borders of the 20th century nation-state, right?
Exactly. If you zoom in, the historical reality is staggering internal diversity. Take China, for example. Beyond the 55 officially recognized ethnic minority nationalities, the majority Han identity is itself an immense umbrella term.
It's not just one group.
No, it covers populations speaking mutually unintelligible languages, like Cantonese, Shanghainese, Hokkien. These groups have vastly different regional cuisines, architectural styles, and local histories.
And then Japan is frequently held up as the ultimate example of a homogeneous island nation, like the ultimate monoculture.
Yet Japan's history involves complex internal boundaries. In the northern island of Hokkaido, you have the Ainu.
Who are the Ainu?
They are an indigenous people with a distinct hunter-gatherer history, religion, and a language that is an isolate, meaning it's completely unrelated to Japanese.
Wow, and that's just in the north.
Right, in the far south, you have the Ryukyuan people of the Okinawa archipelago. They operated as an independent maritime trading kingdom for centuries. They bridged the gap between Japan, China, and Southeast Asia before being fully annexed by the Japanese state.
So it's much more of a patchwork than people realize. The notes also mention Taiwan as an incredibly clear example of this layered reality.
Taiwan's demographics are built on successive waves of history. You have the indigenous Austronesian peoples whose ancestors have been there for millennia.
Right.
Then you have the Hakka and Hoklo populations whose ancestors migrated from the mainland centuries ago. And then you have the wave of mainlanders who arrived with the Republic of China government in the late 1940s.
So it's incredibly complex. And the document uses a fantastic phrase to describe this. It says, identity in East Asia is a stack, not a label.
A stack, not a label. It's a very helpful way to visualize it, because in many Western frameworks, identity is viewed as mutually exclusive. You check one box.
Right. You're either this or you're that.
But historically in this region, multiple systems operate simultaneously. A person can belong to a specific ethnic or linguistic subgroup, practice Confucian ethics to govern their family and social duties, visit Buddhist temples to address spiritual concerns regarding the afterlife, maintain small household shrines to local ancestors, and simultaneously hold political loyalty to a distant imperial center.
All at the same time.
All at the same time. They're not forced to pick just one. The systems are stacked.
Okay, so one of the most critical layers in that stack, and probably the one most prone to cliche, is the concept of harmony.
Harmony, yes.
When you listening hear the word harmony, you probably picture like wind chimes, a quiet Zen garden, maybe a wellness retreat.
Right, a very peaceful aesthetic.
But the source material strips away the mysticism entirely. It argues that harmony is hard-nosed, practical survival tech.
It is the ultimate tool for high-efficiency social engineering. We have to return to the mechanics of the geography we discussed earlier.
Back to the rice paddies.
Exactly. Intensive rice agriculture, which sustains the highest population densities in the region, requires massive, coordinated human labor.
Because it's incredibly labor-intensive.
It is. A single farmer cannot build a terraced mountainside alone. They can't manage a complex network of shared irrigation sluices alone. And they certainly can't harvest a crop before the monsoon floods arrive all by themselves.
So translate that for the listener. Basically, harmony isn't some relaxing yoga concept. It's more like air traffic control for 1 billion people.
That's a great way to put it, air traffic control.
Because, I mean, if one farmer decides to hoard the water or refuses to help maintain the communal dikes, it doesn't just hurt that one farm. The entire village's crop fails. People starve.
The stakes are existential. Therefore, social friction is dangerous. Harmony is not about feeling peaceful. It is about maintaining the functional air traffic control system for a massively dense population.
You conform to the flight path because if you don't, the whole system crashes.
Exactly. You maintain your designated altitude and speed. You fulfill your specific role within the village or the family because the collective survival depends on that structural integrity.
So if harmony is the air traffic control system, then direct confrontational communication is a threat to the flight path.
It's a massive threat.
Which explains another major survival mechanic the notes bring up: indirect communication.
Yes, in a society where preserving the network is paramount, directly challenging someone, pointing out a flaw bluntly, or demanding an explicit no forces a social rupture.
It breaks the harmony.
It causes a loss of face, and face is a metric of your social standing and reliability within the network. So communication naturally evolves to become highly contextual.
You have to learn to read the room.
You do. The things left unsaid, the subtle use of honorifics, or the way a topic is politely deflected, carries just as much meaning as the actual words spoken.
It allows people to negotiate, disagree, and establish boundaries without ever breaking the surface tension of the social harmony.
It's a very sophisticated social tool.
But, hearing all this, the strict roles, the communal pressure, the indirect communication, it feeds right into another massive stereotype. The idea of a collectivist hive mind where individuality is completely crushed.
The sources actively push back against that idea. They address this by examining the balance between state versus society.
Right. Because the centralized states in East Asia have historically been incredibly powerful, capable of mobilizing millions for public works or warfare.
Immense top-down authority.
Yeah.
But precisely because that top-down authority was so immense, society evolved massive parallel structures from the bottom up to protect itself and balance that power.
What kind of structures?
Extended family clans, local village associations, merchant guilds, regional school networks. These networks provided mutual aid, dispute resolution, and identity completely outside the state's direct control.
So individuality isn't dead, it's just expressed differently.
Exactly. Rather than expressing individuality through sheer defiance or tearing down the structure, which, as we established, threatens the communal survival, individuality is highly rewarded through mastery.
Mastery of what?
Of your role. You distinguish yourself by achieving excellence within your prescribed role. Think of the artisan perfecting a specific pottery glaze for 40 years. Or the scholar writing brilliant, even subversive poetry, but doing it entirely within the incredibly strict rules of classical meter.
It is structured flexibility.
Structured flexibility, yes.
Which is a beautiful system when it has centuries to slowly adapt. But what happens when that 3,000-year-old, finely tuned operating system is suddenly thrown into a centrifuge?
It's a violent collision.
Because the document moves us into a period of massive shock, the violent collision with modernity. For millennia, the core system proved capable of absorbing internal rebellions and nomadic conquerors. But starting in the mid-19th century, things changed.
The system faced threats that it could not simply absorb or outlast.
It had to process the Industrial Revolution, the aggressive expansion of Western imperialism, the concept of the modern nation-state, and mechanized global warfare.
And it had to process all of that at the exact same time.
The mechanics of this collision are just staggering. You have the rapid decline of the Qing dynasty in China, struggling to fend off foreign incursions, and massive internal uprisings like the Taiping Rebellion.
And then you have Japan experiencing an existential wake-up call when foreign gunboats arrived.
Commodore Perry, right?
Yes. And this leads them to aggressively dismantle the samurai class and rapidly build a modern, industrialized empire during the Meiji Restoration.
And the Meiji Restoration is a perfect example of the psychological whiplash the sources describe here.
Oh, the whiplash is profound. Within a few decades, Japanese elites went from wielding swords and wearing top knots to donning Western top hats, building railways, and drafting a modern constitution.
All while frantically trying to preserve a core sense of Japanese imperial identity.
Right. And meanwhile, you have the brutal colonization of the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan. You have decades of devastating civil wars on the mainland, culminating in the establishment of the People's Republic.
And then the total devastation of World War II, which is immediately followed by the Cold War lines being drawn right through the region, lines that, by the way, still dictate the map today.
They absolutely do. PRC, ROC, divided Korea. The defining characteristic of all this history is the insane speed of transformation.
Yeah, think about that speed, you listening. Imagine your own country going from the medieval era to Silicon Valley in just 3 generations.
In Western Europe, the transition from an agrarian feudal society to a modern industrial and technological society played out over several centuries. There was time for legal institutions, political philosophies, and daily social habits to incrementally adjust to the machine age.
But East Asia?
East Asia underwent this entire spectrum of change in roughly a century and a half.
The psychological whiplash would be staggering. Think of the physical reality of that speed for a moment. Look at a city like Seoul. Following the Korean War in the 1950s, much of the country was completely devastated. It was an impoverished, heavily agrarian
It
society.
was in ruins.
But within a single human lifespan, within the memory of people still alive today, it transformed into one of the most technologically advanced, wealthiest, hyper-connected megacities on the planet.
Going from subsistence farming to global semiconductor dominance in 3 generations.
The psychological toll of that acceleration is immense.
It generates a profound daily tension between tradition versus progress. The institutions responsible for social stability, families, schools, cultural norms, are still utilizing the software of filial piety, respect for elders, and strict educational discipline.
They are desperately trying to hold the structure together.
Right. But meanwhile, the hyper-competitive global economies they have built demand constant disruption, rapid individual innovation, and global flexibility.
It's a massive compatibility issue. It's like running old software on brand new hardware. And the sources point out this creates very complex trade-offs on the modern map.
Economically, the region is more entangled than ever. Complex global supply chains weave through factories in China, design hubs in Taiwan, and tech firms in Japan and South Korea.
They completely rely on each other to make the modern world function.
They do. But emotionally and politically, the region is highly unresolved. The historical memory of 20th century imperialism and the unresolved borders of the Cold War are not distant history. They are immediate, active pressures shaping daily diplomacy.
And running parallel to those political tensions is a completely new kind of disruptor. It's not a foreign empire or a nomadic cavalry this time.
No, it's something much quieter, but just as dangerous.
It's a collapsing population pyramid.
The demographic reality is the ultimate stress test for the historical system. The region pairs incredible technological dynamism with some of the fastest aging populations and lowest birth rates in human history.
And why is that specifically a threat to their operating system?
Because a social structure built fundamentally on the duty of the young to support the old faces, an existential crisis when there simply aren't enough young people being born to sustain the economic and social load.
It forces us to ask if the 3,000-year-old survival mechanisms can adapt to a threat that comes from within the family structure itself.
It's unprecedented for them.
Which brings us to the final analytical framework offered in the source material. To synthesize all of this, the history, the geography, the trauma, the triumph, the document includes reflections from a subpersonality named Tommy.
The Tommy lens.
The Tommy lens. And it looks at all of this from a completely different angle. It views East Asia not through a dry political lens, but as the ultimate world-building project.
Yes. The Tommy lens observes the region as a massive workshop of layered systems, specifically focusing on how East Asia takes rigid structure and turns it into extraordinary art.
The examples the notes provide are so fascinating because they span from the ancient to the hyper-modern. Let's take traditional calligraphy.
Calligraphy is a great example.
Because you can't just pick up a brush and do whatever you want.
Not at all.
Yeah.
There are incredibly strict, immutable rules about the posture of your body, the pressure of the brush, and the exact sequence of strokes used to form a character.
It's highly regulated. But within that intense constraint, a master calligrapher expresses wild, deeply personal emotion.
The core philosophy of this lens is that creativity does not only flourish in environments of total chaos or boundless freedom.
Which is how we often think about it in the West. Like, break all the rules to be creative.
Exactly. But here, often, the most profound human creativity is forged inside ritual, refinement, and intense pressure. The source text uses a vivid metaphor. It describes this dynamic as a vine finding the seams in a stone wall.
The stone is the rigid social hierarchy, the weight of history, the duty to the collective.
And the vine is human imagination and individuality, twisting, adapting, and blooming violently wherever it can find a crack in the structure.
It's a beautiful image. And this framework explains so much of modern pop culture. We can see this dynamic perfectly in wuxia films.
It's wuxia, the martial arts fantasy genre.
Yeah. The heroes possess superhuman abilities, flying across bamboo forests, battling warlords. It's wildly imaginative.
But mechanically, the entire genre is anchored by incredibly strict codes: chivalry, loyalty to martial arts masters, and societal duty.
The tension between their wild power and their rigid social obligations is what actually drives the drama.
And it is the exact same underlying mechanism that makes East Asian media like anime, K-dramas, and massive video game franchises so globally dominant today.
Because they perfectly balance that tension.
Yes. They provide the deep comfort of structure. Clear roles, rigorous training arcs, duty to a team or society. But it's interspersed with explosive, boundary-pushing creativity and emotional depth.
So what does this all mean? It resonates around the world because it hits a universal human nerve. We all want the security of an ordered system, but we also desperately want the freedom to express our individuality.
The Tommy lens reveals that East Asia's cultural output is a masterclass in holding those two opposing desires together. It proves civilizations can be incredibly advanced, artistic, and prosperous, while still actively wrestling with ancient fears about disorder and belonging.
It really redefines how we understand the region. It isn't a rigid, fragile system terrified of change.
No, it's an engine of structured flexibility. It's like a massive, long-running world-building project that never resets. It just keeps releasing new expansion packs.
The system has survived precisely because it is constantly absorbing new inputs. Whether that's an imported religion like Buddhism, a new phonetic alphabet, or the massive shocks of a modern industrial economy. It takes them and blends them into a framework that remains distinctively its own. Humans constantly blend borrowed things into something they later call their own.
They absolutely do.
Well, we have covered a massive expanse of human experience today. We started with the sheer physical reality of the Earth, the rainfall lines separating the pastoral nomads from the intensive rice farmers.
The hardware.
Right. We walked through the incredible mechanics of the East Asian cycle, where nomadic cavalries conquer the capital only to find themselves translating the Confucian exams to legitimize their rule.
The conquerors becoming the conquered.
Exactly. We felt the dizzying psychological whiplash of societies compressing centuries of industrial and technological modernization into a single human lifespan. And we examine how all that historical pressure produces art that balances intense discipline with wild imagination.
It is a profound historical arc, and it continually challenges our assumptions about what it means for a civilization to progress, to collapse, and to endure.
It really changes how you look at the mechanics of survival, and I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. You've just heard how this massive region has survived by constantly absorbing, adapting, and remixing its conquerors, its traumas, and its history.
A 3,000-year operating system.
Yeah. So now, turn that lens on your own culture. Look at the operating system of your own country. When the pressure mounts, when the next massive technological or social disruption hits, is your society brittle?
Is it designed to completely shatter and demand a total violent reboot if the central power structures fail?
Or is it flexible, built to absorb whatever the future throws at it and remix that disruption into something entirely new?
Can a society survive without hitting the reset button?